Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this webinar. My name is Robert MacIntosh, and we will make a start in just a moment. We'll give people who might be arriving from some other digital event just a moment to join us. So, thank you for your time and attention this afternoon. This is a webinar based on the research that we have been doing in the EDI Caucus, and it will focus particularly on the work that we have been doing to explore equality, diversity, and inclusion in the research process. A couple of pieces of housekeeping for us before we start. The session is being recorded so that it can be made available via the EDI Caucus website. And if for any reason that makes you uncomfortable being recorded, then at least you know that in advance. And secondly, we have two colleagues joining us, Jill and Emmy, as our BSL interpreters. And if you need access to that service, please remember to pin them. And when we come to the question and answer session at the end, if you are a BSL user and want to ask a question but don't want to use the online facility, you can just raise your hand and we will allow you to sign your question and then hear that back through our interpreters. For all of the work in the EDI caucus, we always start with some terms of engagement for the afternoon. And so our ask of you, our audience, would be that you stay engaged in the conversation, resist the temptation to do other things whilst also listening, but of course that is your choice, and to respect in particular our code of conduct. So we don't in the EDI caucus tolerate any form of behaviour that we find difficult, and if that occurs, we reserve the right to remove you from the digital meeting, but we have never yet had to do that, and so it's really just a health warning up front. If we move on to the agenda for our conversation this afternoon, this is what we hope to cover in the webinar. We'll spend a little bit of time in a moment introducing the EDI caucus, and then we will summarise for you the research process that we've been through and the data sets that we have gathered. And we will walk through the 4 good practice guides that we have been working on. We'll talk briefly about the first 3 of those, relating to EDI training, demand management, and the running of flexible funds. And then we'll spend a bit more time dealing with the bias in the peer review process as it relates to research funding. So that's bidding for and being awarded research funds. And then at the end of that, we'll have some time for some questions and answers from you, and I hope that will be a lively debate. So if we move on to the slide around the caucus was funded by a combination of the UKRI and the British Academy. It involved multiple universities, and it was created to support the whole of the research and innovation sector across the UK in producing evidence-based research on EDI practices, with the intention of enabling colleagues in research and innovation roles to access careers in the first place and then to thrive in those careers over the whole of their career span. And we're now bringing forward from the research that we've been doing evidence bases and good practice guides that support inclusive, equitable work cultures that align with UK government legislation, but which also enable those organisations which employ researchers and innovators to work in line with best practice. If we move on to the next slide, Stefanie. So the EDI caucus was organised into 3 work streams, and this afternoon we'll be talking about the work that we have conducted in Workstream 2, which was particularly looking at ways in which EDI practice can be embedded in the research and innovation process and the consequences of the way in which EDI is embedded on those career-defining decisions that individual colleagues, scholars, researchers, or innovators experience, like securing funding, like securing publications. And in essence, the question that we've been asking ourselves in this part of the caucus is what works, in what context, and why does it work? So if we go on to the next slide, Stefanie. So this is who has been working on that. My name's Robert MacIntosh. I'm based at the University of the West of Scotland, and it's been my privilege to be the workstream lead for the last couple of years. You'll hear very shortly from my colleague, Dr. Schneider, who has been the postdoc working on the project alongside Dong Lin. and then supported in the EDI Caucus office by Lizzie Hodson and Fenella Watson, and we had two co-investigators, Clay McGill and Marion Hirsch, who are based at Heriot-Watt and University of Glasgow, respectively. So that's who we are. And in terms of the aims for this afternoon's webinar, we wanted to give you an overview of the research that we've been working on. We want to briefly introduce 3 good practice guides and then offer a more detailed exploration of the good practice guide for research funding, which is available now on the EDI Caucus website. And hopefully, by doing that, to provoke a good conversation with you, our audience, about the ways in which the UK's research and innovation community can take personal responsibility as well as organisational responsibility for trying to change the practices that we use to support careers in this sector. So at that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Steffi Schneider, who's going to talk to you a little bit about our evidence review that we'd started the process with, and then begin to walk us through some of the material that we'll cover. Steffi.
Thank you, Robert. Also, thank you to all of the participants who helped out each other in the chat. I've seen that quite a few of you had problems with echo, and there was the advice given in the chat that sometimes apparently 2 windows open, which is where the echo seems to come from. So thank you very much for those of you who helped resolve this in the chat. So I'll take us back to the beginning, really, to the evidence review that we have published with the Workstream now 2 or 3 years ago. So we set out to examine what peer-reviewed publications and evidence-based reports were out there that looked at the impact of bias in the funding process and also at interventions on overcoming this. And we noticed several things here. One was that there were very few intersectional approaches, but women's experiences were most researched. That doesn't mean that there was a very big body of research. It just means that that was the most we could find. And things that we found will not surprise anyone here. So it was there was evidence for women not aiming as high as their male colleagues, so they didn't apply for as much funding or for as large grants. They didn't lead as many projects, and they received harsher feedback. There was much less research on the experiences by researchers with ethnicities that are tracked in diversity data by UKRI usually, like Black or Asian researchers. But we did, for example, find evidence that suggests that non-Western approaches are still at risk to be evaluated as unscientific, for example. And then we found very little to nothing on the impact of disability, neurodiversity, social class, language barriers, sexuality, etc. What we also found or didn't find was that most resources focus on the later stages of the funding process. So there was at the time very little research on the internal selection process or effective interventions on outreach. And there was very little evidence overall for the effectiveness of interventions like narrative CV or anonymized applications. So this was our starting point. And we tried to fill those gaps with a number of studies that we then started to conduct. So we used a range of methods to arrive where we are today with our 4 guides. We had 4 linked data sets. What that means is that these informed each other. They are not to be seen as 4 silos that only informed one particular study that they were collected for in the first place. So the methods that we applied were interviews, focus groups, video, audio, and written diaries, surveys, and we also had co-production, co-design sessions with stakeholders. We worked with a range of participants, so there were funders, innovators, researchers, and research support. Over the next few slides, I'll give you a little bit more detail on these methods and participants for the 4 studies. So the first one on the left-hand side on your screen is probably our longest running study. That was our Equity Champions Network, where we invited 30 equity champions. So most of these were researchers from across the UK, and they were given an EDI baseline survey where they selected EDI topics that they would like to receive training on. Those 8 training sessions were delivered over the course of 2 years. And after each session, our equity champions gave us feedback in the beginning through video and audio diary recordings, but then at the halfway point, we had a feedback session or two feedback sessions with our equity champs where they actually voiced that they would prefer a broader range of methods to speak to us and reflect. So we also introduced one-to-one conversations, the possibility to submit texts and other visuals. At the end of this process, we had two co-design sessions with the most active equity champions where we put together our EDI training good practice report. Next, I'll speak a bit about our demand management guide that will come out next month. Everything started with the roundtable discussion that we had, I think, also 3 years ago. And then we spoke to applicants, research managers, and funders in separate focus groups. We interviewed research managers from smaller institutions, as well as research managers from research-intensive universities. This was in collaboration with the Oxford Forum's EDI in Demand Management Working Group. We also collected audio diaries. There was an option to either have interviews or audio diaries. And we've also completed our stakeholder engagement sessions for this guide. And here you can see on the left-hand side our forthcoming report on flexible funds. We spoke to everyone invited in our 3 rounds that we organized with the EDI Caucus. So this was the organizers, the panelists, external examiners, as well as reviewers. We held focus groups and we invited reviewers to answer a few questions in the survey because we had hosted reviewer training sessions and we were very keen to find out whether that was helpful. And then lastly, this is the data set for the report that we'll be speaking about in most detail today on the funding assessment process. So this call for the study was circulated with 7 major UK funding bodies, and we eventually held interviews with 35 researchers who frequently sit on assessment panels for these funders in the UK, but also abroad. Most of our participants were professors from research-intensive universities and who are active in STEM subjects. And we also held our co-design sessions with stakeholders, which were our funders, for example. So I'll now hand back over to Robert to speak in a bit more detail about our effective EDI training report. You're on mute, Robert. Muted.
Yeah.
No. There we go.
Thank you, Steffi. So we ran, as Steffi was saying, a series of training sessions over a 2-year period with our equity champions and asked after each session what had made the session effective for them and used that as the basis for developing this guide, which will be published on the EDI Caucus website very shortly. If we go on to the next slide, Steffi, what that guide will tell you across 5 themes that relate to effective EDI training is a set of 12 practices that we think make the most impactful and therefore effective EDI training. And you can see from the graphic that these cover different parts of the training process. And I'll just pause on one part of that process just before we move on to the next section. In the middle of the diagram, you can see in section 3, building a diverse learning community. Our findings from our own study with the EDI champions was that the range of different lived experiences and protected characteristics and role types and length of service that came into the training session created a really powerful learning community where people could learn not just from the trainer, but from each other. And so this is a trailer campaign, I guess, for a guide which will be published very shortly. It's nearly finished. We would encourage you to visit the EDI Caucus website, download the training guide, and look at the ways in which you can take any training that you're engaged in your own organisation and apply the 12 practices set out in the guide there. So that's the first of the 4 guides that we're going to talk about this afternoon, and I'll pass back to you, Steffi.
Thank you. Okay, so our inclusive demand management, or our report on inclusive practices in demand management, will, as I said, will be published next month. A lot has happened in this space since we started the project and since we published the evidence review. And the aim of this good practice report is not to duplicate the work that has happened in the meantime, but to add to it. So, two resources to mention here, of course, EPSRC's roundtables that they held, where they list different EDI interventions that are either working very well in different regions or do not work so well so far. And there's also the aforementioned Oxford Forum EDI and demand management working groups, parameters for equitable demand management that we're also trying to work together with here. So in this report, we'll have two dimensions and that will cover. One will be between the funder and the research organization, and one will be between the research organization and the potential applicant. And the report will discuss what long-term fundamental changes to practice and processes are needed to ensure that EDI interventions can be as effective as intended. And what that means is that they increase the circle of applicants that are supported and put forward in application that is competitive. And lastly, before we move on to our published guide, it's just a short comment on our good practice guide for running flexible funds. So here we will list good practice that helps in turning a flexible fund into a tool that can widen participation in multiple ways. So not only by making the group of awardees more diverse, but also by making the process more transparent, which means that researchers with less experience are invited or have the option to be reviewers and learn about the review process, that these reviewers receive feedback, and also that applicants who, for example, submit an expression of interest, where they then might get the feedback that they are not a good fit for this particular call, that they still receive feedback and can learn from the experience and submit stronger proposals in the future. Okay, so I'll hand back over to Robert.
Thank you. So as we begin to approach the guide for the research funding process, I just point out that the last two guides that we've looked at, the one around demand management and the one around running of flexible funds, are things that tend to happen inside universities because funders are either asking for pre-screening of ideas and demand management, or because a large award has got a portion which is going to be managed through one of these so-called flexible funds. But this guide, the one that we're going to spend most time on this afternoon, relates to funders as they go through the process of deciding what research they want to commission and then who they want to commission to do that research. So if we could move on to the next slide, Steffi. You might remember, and earlier in the chat, the evidence review that we published at the beginning of the project a couple of years ago set out the stages in the research process. Steffi has already said this afternoon that there wasn't that much published research on the early parts of the research funding cycle. It was more about peer review itself. So across the 5 stages that are set out in our evidence review, there's everything from the announcement of the call to preparing applicants to make their submissions, to preparing the review process, and then the review process itself happens, and then funding decisions are taken on the basis of that review process. And what we've done in our guide is break that down into 4 sections of 4 stages of advice for funders when they are considering a funding opportunity. And that's set out in the Good Practice Guide, which is available now on the EDI Caucus website. So it's spread across these 4 stages, and there are 16 practices in total. These practices form a set, they reinforce each other, but individual funders might want to pick up on individual practices from individual stages of this model. In our view, taken as a set, they represent really best practice that we have observed from the funders we have worked with and the data sources of reviewers and panel members that we have been speaking to. In this afternoon session, we're not going to walk through all 16 practices in detail. Rather, what we're going to do is pick out one practice in each of the 4 stages, just to give you an insight into the way in which the guide operates and then we'll pause at the end for some question and answer, and we'd be very happy to go through any further detail that you want. So I'm going to start that process in the first of the 4 stages, which is before the funding has happened, looking to reach out and support as diverse a range of applicants as you can. And in stage 1, practice 1, that is about targeting pre-application engagement. So identifying those communities of researchers or innovators who you want to encourage to participate and who might represent an underrepresented community in your historic profile, and then finding ways to target applications from them. So if we go on to the next slide, Steffi. So in the guide, this is just a screen grab from the guide, and I won't expect you to read all of this because you could read it after the event. But there's a purpose here, which is about trying to make sure that we reach the right kinds of audiences. So those participants who would be people who maybe haven't had funding before, who come from minoritized or underrepresented communities. Maybe those people working in less research-intensive institutions who have less access to the expertise that required to make a successful application for funding, and planning right from the outset to reach out to those underrepresented communities via intermediary organisations, learned societies, staff networks. There are a range of those fora that you could engage with, and to give the longest possible lead time to those groups in order to help begin to prepare a bid early enough that it makes an effective submission. There are some practical things that impact on individual scholars or researchers as they try to do that, which be how long the lead time is and how that lead time falls across things like holiday periods or periods where they may not be at work on a full-time basis. Anyone who's reading Times Higher recently will have seen a call for funding which had a 3-day window for a multi-million-pound call. That clearly favours those researchers who already know how to go about this process and are likely already had prior warning that this call was coming towards them. So early proactive engagement based on targeting those range of applicants that you don't typically see is the stage 1 practice one. And at that, I'll pass back to Steffi.
Yeah. So I'll speak about one practice from stage 2, recruit a diverse range of reviewers. Now, this is not going to be shocking news to anyone, but I'll just elaborate a little bit on what we mean by this. And this goes slightly beyond what we heard reported, that of course in panels it's quite common practice now to ensure that you have representation, for example, that there is a balanced panel of men and women, and for any other protected characteristics as well, if possible. But this is, of course, as we know, in the funding process, these things often people cancel last minute or cannot be available, and then all of this goes out of the window. But this is slightly going beyond this intervention. I'm gonna read out 2 quotes that we are using in the report. So the first one is, I wouldn't say there's any overt discrimination, but I think it's more about a sort of fixed mindset in terms of this is the way we do science. If anybody comes in with a different way of doing things, rather than seeing it as potentially innovative, which is what I might think, they might think that's just the way we do it. And the second one, being able to read somebody else's application and how they've structured it and what goes on in it, that actually is one of the most beneficial parts of being on the panel, as you learn how to write the application so much, which is why having so few early career researchers on the panels, even as observers, is a deficit. So these quotes touch on very different issues within this practice. The first one is that if we recruit reviewers the same way as we always have, we might end up with a very small circle that has more narrow ideas of how we do science, which is the way we've always done it. Often reviewers and panelists are invited because they are award holders themselves. And we've touched on this before, that it's quite an important learning opportunity, for example, through panel observers, which some of our funders are already doing, where those of us who haven't been successful with funding previously or have received less guidance can have a very good insight into the process and learn what's important. So the practices that we are recommending here are, of course, that we want to end up with a diverse group of reviewers, but this also means that there have to be other things in place. So the way we recruit reviewers needs to potentially also include those who haven't been successful yet, but who can still contribute and might actually have a more or might be more open-minded towards innovation in some ways. Reviewer training is something that is often not provided because there's always a level of time pressure, of course. But all of the jokes that we tell about reviewer number two was probably never told in feedback that their reviews and the feedback that they are writing it either isn't very helpful or is quite harsh or isn't constructive. So making sure that there's quality criteria and that there's reviewer training and feedback for reviewers in addition to creating a diverse range of reviewers who are invited into the process, could make the overall peer review process, of course, more inclusive, but also could increase um, the quality of the feedback that is provided or of the reviews that then a panel is working with. Next, from stage three, we will talk about assessing excellence, risk, and EDI. So these three terms are key terms in assessment criteria, of course. So we're looking for excellence. We want to avoid risk. Again, we have two quotes that we would like to read out that hopefully position our practices a bit clearer. So the first quote is, yeah, the track record is a really tricky one because we don't want to find, but because we do want to find some reassurance somewhere that this high risk project is going to be successful, right? So where do we find that reassurance? Second quote is, I have a logbook of phrases from successful grants that either I have written or other people have let me have. I cut them out, I paste them into this logbook, and then I cut and paste them into future proposals. If you don't have a supervisor like me that tells you this or gives you that logbook, I don't know how you could ever compete, especially in multidisciplinary science, right? So these quotes highlight two things. So risk, of course, you want to avoid awarding a lot of money to a proposal that is more likely to fail. So how do we measure how likely a project is to fail? What we often do use is a traditional track record, for example. Um, and secondly, what also often appears to be assessed is what panelists understand to be excellent, which is often quite intuitive. So it comes down to the presentation, to the wording, etc. And this is something that is learned, and this is often learned by people or by applicants who have a professional network that can teach them this, which then again excludes applicants from, for example, institutions that are less research intensive, where we don't have as many previously successful candidates who can provide this kind of guidance. So our good practice advice here would be to problematize the terms risk and excellence. So what do they stand for? What do we intuitively think they mean? And could they potentially benefit the same type of applicant over and over again? And is excellence actually referring to the project idea, or is it more referring to the presentation and the framing of a project? Um, and there's also a lot of the knowledge around how to be excellent, how to be perceived as excellent is tacit. So there's linguistic fluency and a certain presentation that, as demonstrated in the logbook quote, needs to be shown to us in order to understand what it means. It's not something that's intuitively clear. So offering this explicit guidance can open doors for participants who otherwise wouldn't have access to that kind of supervisor, for example, that our participants referred to. And now back over to you, Robert, for the last practice we'll
So just before we come
discuss.
to stage four, practice 15, which I'll speak about in a moment, just I can see some questions in the chat facility. Thank you, Sophie and Daisy. I can see Fenella that you have been answering some of those questions, but just to remind colleagues on the call that there is a question and answer tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And if you put questions in there, everybody on the call can upvote them and see them, and we will use that as one of the means of facilitating the Q&A at the end. So please do use that to paste your questions in. So the fourth and final stage of the review process for a funder looking to award some monies is about providing feedback. And so stage 4, practice 15 is providing formative feedback. And I know that if you're a research funder on this call, one of the things that you will likely have as a response to that is, my goodness, how would I find the time to do that? But our research indicates quite how important it is to provide feedback to successful and unsuccessful applicants to your fund. So if we go on to the next slide, I'm conscious that some of these will feel like a big ask. Commit to providing written feedback to all applicants when you maybe have thousands of applications for limited funds. That could be very time consuming. But think about the analogies between the research funding landscape and the pedagogic landscape inside our universities. We have for decades now had very large class sizes in some subject areas, and where you have hundreds and hundreds of students having submitted essay or assignment work, we're quite used to, in some parts of our professional lives, creating efficient ways of giving written feedback. Common features of successful and less successful applications could be curated. Generative AI might allow you to do a thematic analysis really quickly that you could then apply some oversight to. But despite the additional burden that's perceived around feedback, first of all, I would contest that it necessarily has to be as labor intensive as you might think. But secondly, I would just remind colleagues of the sheer importance of that feedback in order to help someone who's had an unsuccessful application work towards a more successful application in the future. And one of the things that we have seen as a really positive practice, and we used it ourselves in the EDI Caucus Flexible Fund, was asking panel chairs to host a debrief session. So after the funding decision has happened, you record a webinar like this. It's available then for others who missed the session to be able to come back. But it covers off some of those themes around what scored well and not well, what were you looking for, a reflection on the terms of the original call, the assessment criteria used, and how they were interpreted successfully by some applicants and less successfully by other applicants. So that issue around feedback is perceived, I think, as more of a barrier than it needs to be, because in actual fact, if you've, as I have and many others on the call presumably have too, if you've been through the process of being a panelist, a reviewer, or a panel chair, you have likely done much of the work required to offer that feedback. It's then just locking in place the expectation up front of an additional short amount of time to host a webinar or to create some digital written feedback to applicants, which is a very powerful forward-looking developmental attitude to the underrepresented communities that we're trying to target. So we said at the beginning that we wouldn't go through all 4 stages and 16 practices, and we have now had a quick look inside the kinds of practices that comprise the guide. What I would point out as an overriding and concluding remark is that we saw lots of good practice from the funders that supported us and other funders who we interacted with in our research, aimed at making sure that the research funding process was as inclusive as possible. And that good and well-intended research often featured on those protected characteristics defined under UK law, and making sure that they were attended to in the stages of the funding pipeline that we've been looking at. But our findings in the EDI caucus are that there are another set of unprotected characteristics, as we would call them, that relate to things like your contract type. So some colleagues who are on fixed term contracts have a more precarious opportunity to secure future funding. University or institution mission group is important because some universities are much more research intensive than others. And from one of the quotes that Steffi shared earlier, that ability to tap into key phrases from a logbook and reuse them is not uniformly available across the whole of the research and innovation sector. And so our intention with this good practice guide is to try and draw attention to some of those unprotected characteristics. And if we just skip forward one slide, Steffi, on the 2nd of July, there's a blog coming out from HEPI, the Higher Education Policy Institute, which will talk about this guide and talk about that work around protected and unprotected characteristics in the research and innovation ecosystem. And at that, I think we are almost ready to move into our question and answer session. I think if we go on to the final slide. If you have any questions about the conversation today that you want to follow up, you can find the EDI Caucus website and you can contact us using those email addresses that are on the screen. And I can see that that there are some questions that are available in the Q&A session that we'll turn to in a moment. But just before I do so, Steffi, is there anything you want to add by way of concluding remark?
Nope. Thank you very much. I've already opened the chat to see what the lively discussion is.
Yeah. Thank you. And just to
And
remind
the
anybody on
Q&A.
the call who is a BSL user, if you want to ask a question but to do it via the interpreter, if you just put your digital hand up, we will enable that for you. And thank you to our interpreters, Jill and Emmy. So I think I will go through the questions in the chronological order that they came in, Steffi, which is going to mean reading up from the bottom. So what kind of training and guidance would you recommend for peer reviewers to ensure quality and fair reviews? And how do we balance giving this kind of guidance versus appreciating the ask of peer reviewers and not adding to their burden? Which is a great question from Daisy. Um, I think that when we were running our own flexible fund in the caucus, we ran recruitment sessions and then we ran sessions on the evaluation criteria that we would use. And then we would also run a session. I would also recommend running a session where if you are reviewing a large number of proposals, that you do a sample and have a review to see how that is going before you commit to the final set of scores on the doors. I would just, before I'll come to you for a comment on this too, Steffi, but just before I do so, I would also point to that analogy that I made earlier with our life in those of us that work in universities, our life in the learning and teaching space sees us having lots of experience about how to grade and evaluate in ways which are transparent and consistent. Not necessarily perfect, but transparent and consistent. And I think we need to begin to apply some of those disciplines to the way in which we evaluate for peer review in relation to funding applications. Daisy's absolutely right to point to a time-poor, busy set of people who are usually not remunerated for doing this work. But there is a service element to that to our community, to being willing to do it in a way which provides both rigor and insight and transparency to those who have been unsuccessful in the process. Steph, is there anything you would add to that first question?
Probably just that these kind of training sessions wouldn't always have to be just ahead of this very short time span in which you can review applications, for example. This could be something that a funder or an organization or a university runs separately from this with reviewers who are part of the reviewer college or the group of reviewers that can be called on or contacted. As Robert said, there might be particular to a funder or particular to a call, um, new ways in which an assessment, an application is scored. So a calibration exercise is so crucial because it's people just really have very different understandings of what kind of scores should be awarded for which kind of category or which kind of criteria. And the same goes for key terms like what's innovation, what's risk, what's excellence. These should be problematized, but this can often happen across calls, so not just for a particular funding opportunity, and it might be easier then to schedule these. So this is not within a time span that's already quite intense.
Thanks, Steffi. So I've just realised in reading up from the bottom, I'm ignoring the upvoting. So I'll go to the top ranked question, which is from Anthony. You said the guide would be available soon. Could you elaborate? So the guide which we spent most of our time on this afternoon, the guide for peer review of funding applications, is available on the EDI Caucus website now. The guide around EDI training will be available in the next few days, I would imagine, and the other two will come along in the next week or two. We're just in the process of finalising those. So I would hope that by the end of July and certainly by the beginning of the new academic year, all four guides will be available on the EDI Caucus website. And the format of the guide will be as a downloadable PDF document. We also hope to make them a living document on the EDI Caucus website where we can encourage funders to share elements of practice that they already do in relation to the specific practices within the guides themselves. And I would say, in fairness to our funders from UKRI and British Academy and several other funders that we talk to, there is lots of good practice out there. But I think that the benefit of the caucus guide is to bring those good practices together into a coherent framework that covers every aspect of the funding process, right from initial commissioning conversations about the nature of the research you want to fund through to the allocation decisions and then the feedback process. So I hope that answers your question, Anthony. Do we have links to any email addresses for underrepresented communities? And I see, Fenella, you've added some answers into that in the chat facility. So the honest answer, Sophie, is no, we don't have a definitive list of how to reach every underrepresented community. And of course, there are intersectional dynamics around that. But many learned societies, British Academy is one that you've mentioned, Fenella. I know British Academy of Management, which is the one that I'm a member of. They also have ways of reaching networks of researchers, as do individual universities, where they have staff networks and PGR student networks. And so the consolidation of those into a set of ways of reaching those underrepresented communities would be a useful resource. But in actual fact, the guide is just drawing attention to the proactive sense checking of who has historically applied and succeeded with this kind of funding, and therefore which groups are underrepresented and how might we best find them. I think, Steffi, we saw a great example of good practice in this regard from the Arts and Humanities Research Council around the Lucia project, where they wanted particular types of community groups to be engaged in the research. They planned in the time, they found digital opportunities to reach those audiences and did briefing sessions before the funding call came live so that those people could be early into the conversation. And I thought that was a really great example of good practice.
I was going to add, Robert,
So,
as well, is that it's more than just reaching out to those lists. Even if you had the magic list, it's also building and everything else that you guys have been talking about. The message, the kind of comms, which is why I thought I would step in. It's a comms message of we are encouraging these particular groups, especially. So it's more than just emailing it to lists. It's cultivating more of a broader comms message that supports that.
and
Yeah,
just to
I
build,
just,
you go first, Steph.
sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to add to this because it's also really a big part of our work in demand management, for example. So, uh, groups that are not research active currently, they can sit in very research active institutions, but also in institutions that have higher teaching loads where there's just much less opportunity and time, etc., to go for these large grants, for example. And by less opportunity, I mean that of course these are circulated, but it might be much less embedded just in the time that researchers that work at these institutions have. So it's again, like Fenella just highlighted, not so much about a list, but also about this change in approach in the sector overall, that institutions and research group, research mentors, etc. at institutions are called to action for being aware of who's active and who isn't. And also for funders to see where do our applications that tend to be successful or applications that are successful, or where do our communities sit that might have an interest in sitting in town halls and getting information on these calls, but don't end up submitting. So it's a lot about better understanding where where these groups are, where these individuals are, and putting processes in place to reach them and support them and to sponsor them.
Thanks, Steffi. And just to build on that point that you were making, Fenella, I think we're all conscious that we could drown in email. So email is a relatively passive way of drawing attention to things. And I think profile building, community building, webinars, those kinds of digital opportunities like this are opportunities to hear about and have a genuine two-way dialogue about research funding opportunities. So I see that as really important. I will pick up the questions in the chat, but I've just seen, Judith, your question in the chat facility rather than the Q&A. And so we are also talking with colleagues in ARMA about the way in which professional service colleagues inside universities predominantly can support processes like demand management and so on. And you're absolutely right to say that those research services, research manager roles are a critical gatekeeper for knowledge of who inside that particular university might benefit from some advice on how to make a better application. If I come back to Sophie's question in the Q&A facility, the award subject to conditions is again an element of good practice we saw from some of our funders where there was a marginal decision around whether a project was fundable or not fundable. And it was really an encouragement to consider in the review process the opportunity to revise the bid to address areas of known weakness rather than simply reject it. And your question then goes on to say, well, we wouldn't necessarily know that about the EDI characteristics of the individual applicants, but I do believe there are ways in which you could filter that information to the review panel to sensitize them to the pattern of award decisions that they're going to make. That is, in fact, the final practice in the Good Practice Guide to make sure that you fund a representative's portfolio of projects. And I think that that then creates an opportunity for somebody who's maybe at the margin of fundable, not fundable, to make some corrections or additions or adjustments, probably in my view, because they've been starved of the opportunity to have those insights during the preparation of their bid in the first place. So I hope that answers your question, Sophie. Vinod's question about running internal demand management processes and trying to ensure equitable access across that. I think when the demand management guide comes out shortly, the thing that I would observe is that demand management lands very differently in smaller institutions and in bigger institutions. So I heard a vice-chancellor from a large research-intensive university the other day in a different forum talking about having run 40 demand management processes in one academic year, which is a huge burden. And that's one kind of challenge. But in a smaller and maybe less research-intensive institution, one of the challenges is about running those processes when you have relatively few experienced research leaders who are not conflicted by being involved in some of the potential applications. And there are opportunities there, I think, for smaller and less research-intensive institutions to collaborate, partner, buddy up with each other in doing that to try and manage some of the capacity constraints that demand management itself introduces. So that would be my answer to your question, Vinod. Anything you want to add to that, Steffi, before we move on?
No, nothing in particular to the question of how to provide this kind of support to external candidates, but it is the FLF, for example, was quite key to during our data collection as well, because there was a call ongoing, and what was very clear as well is that universities felt like all their EDI interventions that they had, that they always planned to put in place, were much more effective in recurring calls where they could learn from previous rounds, which again is one of the things that we refer to in the EDI demand management report on not just longer lead-in times, but also being able to build this kind of routine makes the whole process more inclusive potentially, or can.
Yeah, yeah. Next on the question list is Pooja's question about narrative CVs. And I think it would be fair to say, Steffi, that when we have done research on this issue around narrative CVs, and I know Dong Lin, who's on the call, the other postdoc, has done work in this space. I'll come to you just to pre-warn you for a comment in a second, Dong. But I think that it's fair to say there are mixed views on whether narrative CVs help or hinder. I think they address a challenge, but I think in addressing that challenge, they introduce fresh challenges themselves. And you're pointing to some of those, Pooja, about the nature of the language used, the fluency with which that is expressed in narrative CV form, and the consistency with which reviewers are able to assess narrative CVs. Just by way of a shameless plug, there is a special issue of the EDI journal that we are leading, and one of the papers that will probably come out on that is looking at narrative CVs and how they have been received and used in practice. And I would describe narrative CVs as something which is a relatively early innovation. It's not been with us for that long. It definitely is trying to move in the right direction, but I don't think it is uniformly and unproblematically a good thing. I think it introduces some other kinds of barriers. Fenella, I don't know if you would have to enable Dong to comment if she wanted to, but Dong, if you could put your digital hand up, then maybe you could comment on your work on narrative CVs.
I have given her access if she's able to.
Thanks, Fenella. And in the awkward silence that follows, if Dong is unable to do that, we'll address the next question. And if you want to contribute, Dong, just shout. Next question. This is a space that's moving very fast, says Lisa Hill. Different forms of decision making. The elephant in the room is the AI in decision making. Do I have views on that? I think that is one of these issues which affects not just peer review of research funding, but actually affects lots of academic work in the learning and teaching and the research side. And of course, it affects the whole of the economy. I was in a conversation with a journal editor the other day who was pointing out an uptick, which in other ways might be seen as very helpful, about how fast reviewers are coming back with reviews of journal articles now. But that was laced with the suspicion that in actual fact they're subcontracting some of that work to generative AI to produce the review in the first place. And I think that, like all parts of the economy, what we really need is some guidance on how to use that ethically and responsibly. It can be a real benefit to particularly those calls where there are very, very large volumes of applications and feedback to be applied to. I mentioned it earlier in this webinar that could allow you to do a thematic analysis of the kinds of feedback points that reviewers are raising and those that fall below the funding threshold. But that has to be done with some oversight from an actual living, breathing reviewer to make sure that that isn't sending spurious advice out into the world. And you're right to point to the fact that it's moving very fast, Lisa. Next was an observation from Mark Dyer. I work in an RKE environment and development cohort for early career researchers. I've recently run an EDI analysis of previous cohort participants to inform future recruitment. Would you be happy to provide feedback on the analysis? If you drop us an email, Mark, we will do our best to do that. But I have to say that the research funding around the EDI Caucus is coming to a close. But if you drop me an email personally or reach out through that EDI Caucus at hw.ac.uk, we'll see if there is something that we can do to help you. And finally, on the question list from Daisy relating to the desire to diversify peer review panels, have we found any issues resulting in disproportionate or overburdening of experts from underrepresented groups? I think that is a definite dynamic in the EDI space, that you can end up with a kind of administrative burden and some emotional labour in representing the whole of a community that is currently seen as underrepresented, Daisy, and I wouldn't deny that. I do, however, think that the point that Steffi was making in relation to one of the practices earlier in this webinar about recruiting a diverse group of reviewers, including those who are inexperienced reviewers, we have found that really powerful, because what they're able to do is A, hold the review process to account, and B, take learning out of that context and share it with their networks, not just for themselves, but for their networks of other early career researchers. And that behind the curtains glimpse of what we were actually looking for and how it was heard or reviewed by review panels in the adjudication of funding decisions is a hugely, hugely powerful insight, which I think we don't do enough of. And so that takes us to the end of the questions, and we're coming towards the end of our time. So I'll offer a closing comment and come to you, Steve.
Robert,
Yep.
we do have one hand raised, so this is
Okay.
assuming that this is a deaf person. So Liz, I'm just going to promote
Sure.
you to a panel so that if you want to sign a question, I think it requires the person to accept it.
Steffi, as that is happening, I wonder if we could stop screen sharing, because I guess colleagues on the call will now have seen that information slide for a while. That might allow us to see slightly more of the people on the call.
While we'll see if Liz wanted to ask a question with a camera on. The other thing I was going to ask is we've got a culture survey that we are running, and we're looking for as wide a reach as possible. So I'm going to put a link to the chat for that, but it is basically about workplace culture in the research and innovation sector in the UK. So it's everybody who works there, everybody on this call will be able to fill in this survey, and that's going to help us do some further analysis as we end this caucus. So it doesn't
Thanks,
look like
Vanessa.
Liz has kept her
No,
hand up. So
Liz has said in the digital chat she did it by accident, so
okay,
sorry for
that's fine.
triggering that, Liz. I'll just offer my kind of closing plea and call to action, then invite Steffi you to wrap the seminar up. The issues that we've been discussing are systemic and long-standing in the research and innovation community, and it's easy to stand back from patterns of data that say there are not enough people from this underrepresented demographic or community who receive funding. We've argued in this webinar that part of that is to do with protected characteristics, and part of it is to do with these so-called unprotected characteristics. But my ask of each of us individually is what can we personally take some responsibility for in changing practice in relation to peer review? And there are things, because we participate both as applicants and reviewers, that we can personally do to try and account for that. We could, for example, come back to our own institution and run a briefing session for colleagues on how that experience was. Of course, that has to be GDPR compliant, and you can't disclose the details of confidential projects that you've seen. But there are things that we can do which are more individual than organizational. And those of us that have leadership positions in funders and in universities or other organizations that employ innovators or researchers have a leadership responsibility and opportunity to change practice too. And the only way in which we will change the systemic outcomes and patterns that we see is by doing something different. And if we wait for some third party to come along with a policy or legislative requirement, we will wait longer than if we begin to take action ourselves. So thank you from my perspective for your time and attention this afternoon. I would encourage you to download the good practice guide that is there on peer review funding, and to come back to the website and download the others in the next couple of weeks as they become available. And at that, I would also like to thank Fenella and the team from the EDI Caucus for all of the support over the period in running the project, but also to thank Steffi and Dong as the two postdocs who've made the research happen. So I'm going to give the last word to you, Steffi.
Thanks very much, Robert. Thanks for everybody for coming today and for engaging with us on this, and also for just giving us feedback on the information that we provided. This is a really helpful and amazing dialogue. And I think the closing remark I would like to make is that EDI is not the interventions, the EDI interventions that we're suggesting, that anyone is suggesting, are not for a small minority group, but they are for everyone, to make the workplace more inclusive, to make it happier, and to produce better research that represents all of society. And these interventions are not easy fixes, easy quick fixes, but they often require us to really question the process as a whole, take a step back, and be open-minded for changes that are really fundamental and consequential. And yeah, I'm very hopeful still, regardless of everything, that enough of us are open-minded to push this forward. So thank you, everybody, for showing up.
So thank you, folks. Have a great afternoon.